setup process may have seemed a bit like wizardry. Packages and libraries magically installed, and the TypeScript compiler psychically knowing what to do. Welcome back to Angular 2 Getting Started from Pluralsight. My name is Deborah Kurata, and in this module, we revisit the basic files we need to set up an Angular application. What looked like installation wizardry was instead a set of carefully defined setup files. Let's peek behind the curtain and see what those files are, what information they contain, and how to use them. In this module, we'll take a closer look at the TypeScript configuration file, npm package file, TypeScript definitions file, and the libraries defined in index.html. Let's get started. To begin coding with Angular quickly at the beginning of this course, I provided the basic files needed to set up our development environment. Those files are part of the starter files you may have downloaded from the GitHub repository for this course, as detailed in the First Things First module. Now let's revisit each of these files and see what they do. Note that the content of these files may change over time, but it's unlikely that the basic purpose and use of the files will change. So don't worry if your files don't look exactly as those shown in these demos. With that said, let's get to know some of these files better, starting with tsconfig.json. This file is a TypeScript configuration file. It specifies TypeScript compile options and other settings. The TypeScript compiler, TSC, reads this file and uses these options and settings. The presence of this file in a folder indicates that the folder is the root of a TypeScript project. Most of today's browsers only understand the ES5 version of JavaScript, so we need to tell the TypeScript compiler to transpile our TypeScript code into ES5 code, so ES5 is our target. The source map option defines whether TypeScript should generate map files. Map files assist with debugging, so it's a good idea to set this to true. The emit decorator metadata and experimental decorators options provide support for our decorators. These must be set to true or our Angular application won't compile. The no implicit any option defines whether the TypeScript compiler will default untyped variables to a type of any if it can't infer the type. If we want to ensure all of our variables are strongly typed, we can change this to true. The exclude option tells TypeScript not to compile specified files or all files in specified folders. We include the Node modules folder here since we already installed the JavaScript versions of these files. The next two are a little more arcane. When installing TypeScript definition files, the typings command installs two versions of the typings. One set appropriate for the browser in a browser folder, and one set appropriate for Node in a main folder. If TypeScript compiles both of these folders, we'll get duplicate identifier errors. Since we are running in the browser, we want to exclude the typing/main folder and the typing/main.d.ts file so we don't get duplicate type definitions. Feel free to add or change this file as needed to configure the TypeScript compiler to the needs of your application and environment. So, disappointingly, the TypeScript compiler isn't psychic. It uses this file to know how to compile our TypeScript code. Next, let's look at the package.json file. One of the most important files for successful setup and development time execution is the npm package file, or package.json. When setting up Angular, we use npm to install the Angular libraries and all of their dependencies. And we use npm to run scripts, such as npm start to launch our application. Looking at the contents of this file provides helpful insight into how npm knows what to do. This file contains basic information about the application, such as the application name, version, author, description, and so on. For our purposes, the key settings in this file are scripts, dependencies, and dev dependencies. These are the settings that provide the magic when installing and running an Angular application. Let's look at the dependencies first. In this file, there are two sets of dependencies. The dependencies define the libraries that our application needs to run. Here is Angular, System.js, our module loader, and reactive extensions, for example. And I added Twitter Bootstrap here because we use it in the sample application for styling. The dev dependencies define the additional libraries we need for development. Here is where we define TypeScript and some support libraries that the scripts use. We'll talk about these scripts in a moment. At the beginning of this course, we set up Angular by typing npm install from the folder containing this file. When we issue that command, npm reads these dependencies, locates each of these libraries in its repository by name, and installs the specified version. But please note that at the time of this recording, Angular is still in beta. You will most likely see different version numbers than shown here. Feel free to add or modify these entries as needed to include any other third-party library or NPM package. Up here, we see the list of scripts that we can run with npm. We can execute any of these scripts from the command line using npm run and the script name, except for start, which does not require the run keyword. Using npm run tsc runs the TypeScript compiler. We can use the -w flag with the TypeScript compiler to run the compiler in watch mode. This keeps the compiler running, awaiting changes to any TypeScript files, and recompiling as needed. LightServer is a lightweight static file server that we use to run our application without any backend server, and was specifically written for Angular 2. Using npm start runs the TypeScript compiler and the LightServer at the same time. So whenever we save a change to any of our files, TSC will recompile them, and LightServer will refresh the browser automatically so we can immediately see our changes. We saw this in action throughout the demos in this course. Using npm run typings runs the typings tool. For TypeScript to be strongly typed, it needs to know about each library's types. These files are stored in TypeScript type definition files, indicated with a d.ts extension. Most libraries install their own associated TypeScript type definition files, so we don't have to do anything extra to install them. We put any other typings files in the typings.json file. For Angular, we need a typings file for the ES6 shim. We'll talk more about shims in a few moments. Running the typings tool installs any typings defined in this file. We can see this one was installed here and here. Going back to the packages.json file, post install is called by npm automatically after it successfully completes the installation of the package. Here we have set up post install so that after npm install is complete, any TypeScript type definition files in the typings.json file are installed as well. Now let's move on to the index.html file. We've covered the contents of the index.html file previously in this course, but let's spend a moment looking closer at the libraries we are loading with the script tags. Let's start from the bottom up. These last two we added ourselves during the demos. This one is for the router, and this one is for HTTP. Then we have the libraries for Angular itself, for the reactive extensions, which provide observables, and for System.js, the module loader we are using. The other libraries here are polyfills and shims. A polyfill adds code written in ES5 to support ES 2015 syntax. A shim is a library that brings a new API to an older environment. Both help our TypeScript code get transpiled into ES5 code. So there is no wizardry here, just a set of carefully defined setup files. In this module, we revisited the setup files. We found that the TypeScript compiler is not psychic. Rather, it uses the TypeScript configuration file for options and settings when compiling our TypeScript code. We then saw that NPM is not wizardry. Rather, it uses the NPM package file to specify the operation of NPM install, NPM start, and NPM run. We peeked at the TypeScript definitions file containing one typing we needed, and we looked at the library specified in the index.html file script tags. Only one module left. The goal of this course was to guide you down the right path, making your own adventures with Angular 2 more pleasant and productive. Let's recap our journey and review the answers to the key questions we identified at the beginning of this course. What is a component? We discovered that a component is a view defined with a template, logic defined with a class, and metadata defined with a decorator. Where do we put the HTML for our user interface? Either in the metadata using the template property, or in a separate HTML file using the template URL property in the metadata. When should we use binding? Anytime we want to display a component class property value in the view. When we want to control the DOM by setting a DOM element property in code. When we want to respond to user actions. And when we want to display a component class property and update the property when the user makes a change. Why do we need a service? We uncovered several reasons for building a service: to implement functionality that is independent from any particular component, to share data and logic across components, and to encapsulate external interactions, such as with data access. And how? How do we build an Angular application? With code that looks like this. Export a class, attach a decorator, and import what we need. Along the way, each module provided a set of checklists containing steps and tips. Feel free to revisit and reference these checklists as you start building your own Angular applications. This course covered the basics, but there is so much more. On Pluralsight, the Angular 2 First Look course provides a comparison of Angular 1 to Angular 2 and presents a more full-featured sample application. And watch for additional Angular 2 courses coming soon to a device near you. The Angular 2 documentation is very comprehensive and growing every day. It is a great reference to everything Angular. And I've set up a GitHub repository for this course so you can use it as a starting point or learning aid. It provides starter files if you want to try building an application yourself, or you can review the completed course files here. At the beginning of this course, we defined Angular as a JavaScript framework for building client-side applications using HTML, CSS, and a language such as JavaScript. But this is a somewhat narrow view of Angular, focusing on using it just for client-side web applications. But Angular is actually so much more. A better definition is that Angular is a platform. It supports multiple languages, multiple templating syntaxes, and multiple rendering targets. It has features to support mobile web, such as Material Design, a set of widgets that work across devices, Angular Universal to pre-render views on the server, and Web Workers for background processing. And Angular supports native mobile development using products such as Ionic and NativeScript. Keep an eye on Pluralsight and Angular.io for more information on these exciting